Welcome to Exodus and Beyond. I'm your host, author R.J. von-Bruening. This video series will be exploring the Exodus from an esoteric understanding, as explored in my book, The Exodus and Beyond, Book 2 of Unlocking the Dream Vision. In this video, we'll start exploring and understanding the esoteric timeline. If you enjoyed this video, please hit the like button below and subscribe for future videos. This series presents information based in part upon theory and conjecture of the system of esoteric symbolism. The purpose is to suggest some possible interpretation, but not necessarily the only one, to the many mysteries we will explore. In this new series, we will explore my second book, The Exodus and Beyond. We will discover the hidden secrets of the forgotten history of the great Exodus out of Egypt. And in the process, we'll also go far beyond what is traditionally believed or found in the biblical story. In this part of our journey, we will explore in detail the mysterious twin brothers that continued the great Exodus after the deaths of Moses and Aaron that we first encountered in the Dream Vision of Enoch in chapter 89, verse 39 of the book of Enoch. And I saw till they left off crying for that sheep and crossed that stream of water. And there arose 2 sheep as leaders in the place of those that had led them and fallen asleep. Literally had fallen asleep and led them. Book of Enoch, chapter 89, verse 39. We will discover these few unassuming lines from the dream vision found deep within the book of Enoch will reveal an astonishing set of events that will completely change our understanding of the great Exodus out of Egypt. It will also answer the great mystery of why all the different ancient cultures of the world all have the same architectural style, gods, iconography, mythology, and the same polytheistic religious belief structures built around the complete devotion and sacrifice to the gods in a way that's never been imagined before. But before we can begin our journey into the Exodus, we must first fully understand the esoteric timeline we first discovered in Unlocking the Dream Vision, the secret history of creation. During this process, we will expand upon and reconcile this highly radical timeline with the accepted traditional historical timeline that we're all familiar with today. Our starting point is to understand that the accepted historical timeline was initially conceived of and imposed by the learned fathers of the early Catholic Church. This change enabled the Catholic Church to take approximately 36,000 year-long history of ancient Egypt that they had and fit it into their biblical interpretation that the world was only about 6,000 years old. To overcome this little dating problem, the learned fathers of the early Catholic Church adopted the inspired solution by the Christian scholar Uberus, who lived from about 2060 AD to around 340 AD, whereby he proposed that the year I take to be a lunar one, consisting, that is, of 30 days, what we now call a month, the Egyptians used formerly to a year. This allowed him to take the approximately 36,000 years of Egyptian history as recorded by the Egyptian historian Manetho and realign it with the Catholic Church interpretation that the world was only 6,000 years old by simply dividing it by 13. Furthermore, this little sleight of hand has been going on ever since. Well, this gives us a basic idea, and this has been spoken about by numerous different authors over the years like Graham Hancock and others. But this little change is slightly more complicated in actual practice. Because if you take the accepted historical timeline and multiply it by 13, you will rapidly discover that it only appears to work for some dates and not others. This anomaly occurs due to the fact that the learned fathers based this new timeline around 4 critical historical events with an esoteric understanding of the Exodus itself. By examining each of these 4 events, we will begin to understand how the learned fathers of the early Catholic Church put it into practice, and more importantly, how this esoteric timeline is connected to the accepted historical timeline we're all familiar with. The first of these 4 events was, of course, the great Exodus out of Egypt by the Israelites. The second was when Enoch was taken away from the generations of the earth and the destruction of King Solomon's temple that followed shortly after. The third event is, of course, the crucifixion of Jesus Christ, and the fourth event being the reign of Justinian I from approximately 527 AD to 565 AD, with his revival of Roman law. The final piece of the puzzle is an esoteric understanding of the Exodus, which we will explore further as we examine the other events. To understand how the learned fathers of the early Catholic Church changed the timeline, we must first start with the accepted historical timeline of the destruction of King Solomon's temple and the Babylonian captivity of the Israelites, which is traditionally believed to have occurred around 587 BC or possibly 586 BC. However, as we discovered in our journey through the Dream Vision of Enoch, the event of Enoch being taken away from the generations of the earth and the destruction of King Solomon's temple occurred approximately around 14,415 BC. Additionally, we also discovered that the Great Exodus out of Egypt occurred almost 18,000 years earlier, around 32,000 BC. Now, if we take these two radical dates and divide them by 13 and compare them to the accepted timeline, we'll discover that they just do not work out correctly no matter what you do. The reason why this does not work out is because we still lack a small but highly critical piece of esoteric knowledge about the Great Exodus out of Egypt that is not known or even suspected by the general public. This missing piece of knowledge is a radically different interpretation of the Israelites' 40-year journey through the wilderness when they refused to cross the Jordan into the promised land of Canaan. This radically different esoteric interpretation is that the 40 years of the Israelites wandering the wilderness recorded in the biblical story is really representing 40 generations. That might seem like quite a leap for most, but as we've already learned through our journey through the Dream Vision of Enoch, the biblical story has been edited with numerous books completely removed or radically changed to fit different political or religious viewpoints throughout the centuries. Additionally, we have also learned of the small change that significantly impacted our overall understanding of the entire story. In this particular case, it will allow us to reconcile this radical esoteric timeline with the more accepted historical timeline of today. Our first step in understanding this esoteric interpretation, that the 40 years of the Israelites wandering in the wilderness actually represents 40 generations, is to figure out how long each generation lived. To answer this question, we need only return to the biblical story of Abraham and his descendants, as contained within the book of Genesis. Within the story of Abraham, we discover that Abraham and his descendants are said to have lived approximately 140 years. This small but critical piece of information will allow us to start learning how the Christian scholars and the early learned fathers of the church came to their inspired solutions. Our next set of steps is to return to the esoteric dates of 32,000 BC for the Exodus and 14,415 BC for when Enoch was taken away from the generations of the earth and the destruction of King Solomon's temple soon after. If we take our newfound esoteric knowledge that the journey of the Israelites wandering through the wilderness was 40 generations and that each generation was approximately 140 years long, and we multiply them together, we will get a total of 5,600 years. The next step in this process is to take this number and subtract it from the esoteric start date of the Great Exodus out of Egypt of 32,000 BC, which will give us a date of 26,400 BC. The next step is then to subtract the date of Enoch when he was taken away from the generations of the earth and the destruction of King Solomon's temple of 14,414 BC from this number of 26,400. This gives us 11,985 years. This number, 11,985, is the all-important number that we take and divide by 13, which then gives us 922 years. This 922 is the number that allowed Uberus to create his inspired solution. To understand what he did next, all we must do is take this number of 922 and add it to the accepted historical date of the destruction of King Solomon's temple of 587 BC. This then gives us a date of 1509 BC. The final step is then to add the 40 years of wandering in the wilderness to the traditional Exodus story of the Bible, which then provides us a date of 1549 BC. This date of 1549 BC is the generally accepted historical date given for the end of the second intermediate period and the beginning of the new kingdom in Egypt, better known as the 18th dynasty, which began after the Hyksos expulsion. This is remarkably close to the accepted time when the heretic pharaoh Akhenaten ruled. The date of 1549 BC is also about the same time that modern scholars place the Mycenaean civilization at its height. The next step in the process is to realize that the early learned fathers of the Catholic Church were fully aware that approximately 14,400 plus years had passed since the destruction of the first temple until their own time, which was around 1600 years ago by our own current modern calendars. This is the next critical piece of information that allows us to understand how the Catholic Church reconstructed the timeline to fit into their belief that the earth is only 6,000 years old. If we divide 14,415 by 13, this gives us the number 1,109. If we take this number and then add it to the traditional historical date of 587 BC for the destruction of the first temple, we end up with the date of 522 AD. Remarkably, this date is within 5 years of the accepted historical date of the first year of the Emperor Justin's first rule. What makes this time frame so important is that the Emperor Justin sought to revive the Roman Empire's imperial greatness and to recover much of the lost western half of the Roman Empire during his time of reign. Historians typically view Justinian's rule as a distinct epoch in the history of the late Roman Empire and the beginning of what is known as the Byzantine civilization. His reign was marked by the ambitious but ultimately only partly realized restoration of the empire. Justinian was unsuccessful in his grand ambitions to return the Roman Empire to its former glory. However, he was successful in inspiring Byzantine culture into a great new blossoming, and he also launched a significant building program. Although Justinian is usually best known for his grand building projects, trying to realize his dream of restoring the Roman Empire, actually he left a more incredible legacy that still impacts our modern world to this very day. This aspect of his legacy was that he began the uniformed rewriting and codifying of all Roman law. This effort resulted in the excellent legal work known as the Body of Civil Law, which still provides a foundation of civil law in a great number of modern-day states. More significantly, it provided the fundamental legal framework that was become the basis for creating the earliest kingdoms of Europe that would later grow into the many different peoples, cultures, and nation-states of modern-day Europe. This piece of information allows us to understand that the estimated rebirth of the last major religion of the Lord God faction that we explored during our journey through the Dream Vision of Enoch must also be closely related to Justinian rule and the rebirth of Roman law. This also allows us to realize that Justinian's reign is the real cutoff point between the ancient and modern world with this new historical timeline created by the Catholic Church. It is also the point in history whereby the learned fathers of the early Catholic Church began to quietly hide from the world the long forgotten 10,000-year dark age that befell on humanity that occurred after the great terrible destruction of the heaven and the horrors of the final battles that were remembered as the end times or the end of days that led to the great transformation. The final piece to this dating puzzle is the death of Jesus Christ. The dating of this all-important event was handled quite differently than the rest of the timeline. That it was simply placed 500 years before the reign of Justinian. The reason for this appears to be primarily related to the millennialism and the apocalyptic thought that consumed much of Western Christianity during this time. At this time, countless Christian philosophers held many debates that furiously argued over when Jesus Christ was actually born and when the world would actually end. And these debates still continue to this day. These debates led large number of early Christians, both literate and illiterate, to accept the idea that the apocalypse would occur around the year 1000 AD. Which, according to the new accepted timeline presented by the early Catholic Church during Justinian's reign, would be 1,000 years after the crucifixion of their Savior, Jesus Christ. It appears that Justinian and the early Catholic Church merely placed themselves at the midpoint of this apocalyptic and millennialism type of thinking of when the apocalypse would happen. The primary reason this was done was simply to keep the peace within early European society. It was in many ways a simple political act to contain a highly emotional subject that allowed the Catholic Church to acknowledge the millennialism groups while also keeping the idea of the apocalypse far enough in the future that it would not present any real political problems or potential issues for the Church or Justinian's rule. From these debates and the inspired solution for the problems of the timeline, that we see the beginning of a trend that the Catholic Church and Western civilization in general continues to this very day, which is to always place early historical events and civilizations with some multiple of 500 years before the Catholic Church arrival in any given area of the world. For example, in Mesoamerican civilizations, they are all dated from 500, 1,000, 1,500 to 2,000 years before the arrival of the Europeans and the priests of the Catholic Church. The same practice holds true for all the civilizations of the Far East, like China and India. Although at the present, you may have doubts about such a claim. Nevertheless, as we proceed through the rest of our journey, it will become apparent that no other conclusions can actually be made. All this allows us to realize that the significant events within the accepted historical timeline are very simply divided by 13 and then either added or subtracted from either the Exodus or the destruction of King Solomon's temple to give us the historical dates that we're all familiar with. Additionally, and to help add another layer of confusion, the original accepted start date for ancient Egypt is directly based upon this interpretation of the date of the death of Jesus Christ. This is also another example of how the early fathers of the Catholic Church were very much aware of the esoteric timeline. To understand how the accepted starting date of 3100 BC for Egypt is based upon the accepted idea that Jesus Christ lived approximately 2,000 years ago, we must remember our esoteric knowledge that the Great Flood of Noah occurred approximately 72,000 BC. We must then subtract the esoteric time of the Exodus from this number, which will give us 40,000 years. The next step is to take this number and then divide it by 13, which will give us 3,077 years. Then we need only to add this number to the accepted historical date of the death of Jesus Christ, which is 33 AD, and this will then give us a date of 3110 BC. This date of 3110 BC is only 10 years off from the modern day accepted historical date of Upper and Lower Egypt's unification by the pharaoh Menes, which is typically placed between 3,200 to 3,000 BC. With this final piece of the puzzle, we can now understand how the learned fathers of the early Catholic Church We're able to use this inspired solution to fit almost 72,000 years of human history into a 6,000-year timeline. Additionally, with us now being aware of how this historical sleight of hand and how it is accomplished, we can now also easily understand how it has been slightly modified over the centuries into the historical timeline we are familiar with today. This allows us to place the accepted historical timeline over the esoteric one. By doing this, this allows us to get a much clearer picture of how long ago many of these great historical events actually occurred and why so much information is missing. In order for simplicity, we will use the accepted timeline for ancient Egypt for this example, since much of the accepted historical timeline is built around it. Please note that these dates are only an approximation due to the great uncertainty of the dating for both the traditionally accepted historical timelines and the esoteric one. Within the historical timeline, the proto-dynastic period of Egypt is traditionally placed at 3200 BC to 2665 BC and includes the first and second dynasties. In the esoteric timeline, these would be the years between 72,000 BC to 65,000 BC. Additionally, it is common for all the events that occurred before the Great Flood to be included in the traditional timeline, which unfortunately just adds to the confusion of this ancient time. The next great time period in Egypt is known as the Old Kingdom, which is traditionally believed to have been between the years 2664 to 2155 BC, under the rule of the third to sixth dynasties. Within the esoteric timeline, these are the years between 65,000 to 50,000 BC. It is during the Old Kingdom that scholars believe that the Great Pyramid was built. However, as we know from our journey through the Dream Vision of Enoch, the Great Pyramid was actually built long before the Great Flood and related to the fall of all the Watchers and the Lord of the Light. But we also learn that soon after the aftermath of the Great Flood had subsided and the earth had been reconquered, the other two large pyramids were built upon the Giza Plateau as a political statement. As the Old Kingdom came to an end, primarily because of political upheaval and civil war, it gave birth to the time known as the First Intermediate Period, which is believed to have occurred in the traditional timeline of between 2154 BC to 2052 BC, with the 7th to 10th dynasties ruling during this time. Within the esoteric timeline, this would place these dynasties' rules between 50,000 BC to approximately 47,000 BC. After the great internal upheaval of the First Intermediate Period, the Middle Kingdom was born. It was a time that was marked by great growth both economically and with Egypt's population under the 11th, 12th, and parts of the 13th dynasties. This time is normally placed between 2052 BC to approximately 1786 BC. In the esoteric timeline, these would be the years between 47,000 BC to approximately 39,000 BC. Towards the end of the Middle Kingdom, population growth appears to have outstripped food production, and this led to great suffering and internal strife for the Egyptian people. It is also during this time that the Egyptians began to allow foreign tribes to settle in the eastern part of the Nile Delta. As we will explore later, this settlement of these tribes helps bring about the Second Intermediate Period in Egyptian history, which is normally considered to be between 1786 BC to 1554 BC, with the 13th to 17th dynasties and the rule of the Hyksos occurring during this time. Within the esoteric timeline, the Second Intermediate Period are the critical years between 39,000 BC to 32,000 BC. It is during these years that the story of Abraham, the destruction of the cities of the plains, and the earliest settlements of the first Hebrews in Egypt begin to occur. As we will discover, it is toward the ends of this time of foreign rule of Egypt that the event, remembered as the Hyksos expulsion, but also remembered as the Great Exodus out of Egypt in the Bible, begins around 32,000 BC. It is during the last years of the Second Intermediate Period that the 18th dynasty arises and establishes the New Kingdom, historically believed to be the years between 1554 BC to 1075 BC under the rule of the 18th to 12th dynasties. Within the esoteric timelines, these are the years between 32,000 BC to 26,400 BC. As we explore the Exodus in the following videos, we will discover that this is the time period of the legendary divine brothers who continued upon the great journey out of Egypt once Moses and Aaron had passed from this earth. It is also during this time that the mysterious sea people eventually fall upon Egypt. The third intermediate period is believed to have occurred between the years of 1075 BC to 664 BC, with the 21st to 25th dynasties ruling Egypt during this time. Within the esoteric timeline, these are the years between 26,400 BC to 14,415 BC, when a great dark age fell upon humanity. It was an age that lasted until Enoch was taken away from the generations of the earth, and shortly before the destruction of King Solomon's temple and citadel. The final phases of Egyptian history are the late period between 664 BC to 332 BC, with the 26th and 31st dynasties ruling. In the esoteric timeline, this would be the years between 14,415 BC to approximately 12,600 BC. Soon after, Egypt came under Greek rule, normally believed to have occurred between 332 BC to 30 BC. This was followed by Roman in Egypt, which is historically placed between 30 BC to 476 AD. Within the esoteric timeline, these last phases of Egyptian history, which once again placed the Egyptians under foreign rule, would have occurred between 12,600 BC to 10,775 BC. These are the final years before the Great Destruction, as we explore during our journey through the Dream Vision of Enoch, covered in Unlocking the Dream Vision, the Secret History of Creation. As we journey through the Exodus and beyond, we will gain a much better understanding of the critical events that occurred during the years between the Great Exodus at approximately 32,000 BC to the destruction of King Solomon's temple and citadel somewhere around 14,415 BC, and the Great Dark Age that came upon humanity during these years. To begin our journey, we must first answer the critical questions concerning the identity of the people known as the Hebrews, which we will explore in our next video. If you enjoyed this video, please hit the like button below and subscribe for future videos.